Hey, this is Module 1, Lecture 2 for Introduction to International Relations. And what we're going to do in this lecture is look at two of the major articles that come from your Mingst and Snyder textbook that were assigned for this part of the module. So what we're going to be doing is kind of laying the groundwork for understanding the differences between the different kinds of theories or schools of thought in international relations. So for each of the schools of thought that we look at, I'm going to explain the central argument, the key actors, and the main instruments of international relations. And so the first one, which we're going to talk about when we get to Module 2, is realism. And the central argument in realism is that states compete for power, and it often results in conflict. You've got multiple states that have very similar ideas about survival in the international system, and because they're always vying for power against one another, this creates a very conflict-prone kind of international system. The key actors for realists are states and nobody else. States are more important than any other kind of actor in international relations, and if we look at examples of where states are and continue to be important, you can see how the argument might play out that in fact states continue to hold a place of prominence in international relations, and that individuals or norms or organizations are simply the conduits through which states exert their power. That's the main argument about the role of states if you're a realist. And to go along with that, the main instruments that are important to realists are military power and state diplomacy. So they're not as concerned with understanding the role of what they call soft power or less militaristic kinds of means. For realists, if you want to understand how states are able to control the actions of other states, how they're able to wield influence in the international system, it's through their military power primarily, and then kind of secondarily, the diplomacy that they may engage in with other states. A different school of thought, which we're also going to spend some time on, is liberalism. And the central argument of liberalism is that through things like international trade and institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, and others, these things promote peace. So unlike realists who think that the state of nature in the international system is kind of, to paraphrase from Thomas Hobbes, nasty, brutish, and short, for liberals, states actually work together far more often than they engage in conflict with one another. So we can see how institutions which facilitate greater interactions between states lead to more peaceful ends and more cooperative situations. The key actors for liberals are both states and international institutions. An important difference between realists and liberals is that liberals argue that these international institutions have a kind of value, have an impact on international affairs separate from what states want them to do. States decide to put them into organize them because they feel like there's some value to organizing them. That if a state didn't want to, they would simply decide to not participate. But where you have international institutions at place, it suggests that some states are willing to give up a little bit of their individual ability to make decisions because they think that the decisions made by international institutions will incorporate more views and perhaps lead to more cooperation and less conflict. And so the main instruments that are utilized in a liberal school of thought are international institutions and also trade. Through these two areas, liberals argue these are the things that really matter in international relations. Again, states don't set up international institutions for fun. They do so because they think that they're going to benefit from them, and that benefit might be increased efficiency, it might be reduced conflict, and trade also helps to grease the wheels of the international system for reasons that we'll talk about more when we get to the lectures on liberalism. And then finally, although this is a little bit confusing, we'll see the terminology change as we go through, so I put it in parentheses for the moment here. You have what was previously known as idealism. This kind of grew out of, or as a perhaps reaction to realism. But the way that the author talks about it in this particular article that we had to read for the module today This actually aligns more with the school of thought known as constructivism, which we spend some time on again at a later date. So for idealists, international politics is shaped by ideas, values, and culture. So unlike realists, it's not just about power, and unlike liberals, these idealists or constructivists think that it's not just about institutions. It's about things that are even broader in their orientation, things that are more abstract, maybe more difficult for us to really pin down, but they're just as, if not more important than the other things that liberals and realists argue. Again, kind of continuing with this trend, the key actors for constructivists are the people who promote new ideas, transnational activists, and non-governmental organizations, because we can see that these types of groups have an independent impact and influence what states do and how states relate to one another. So it's no longer the case that states are the only important actors in international relations. We can look at NGOs, activists, and ideas and realize that they've had their own kind of independent impact, and that's important to recognize. And again, keeping along with the ideas that are motivated by a kind of constructivist mindset, the main instruments for those who are taking a constructivist approach are ideas and values. So it's not a question about how many guns do you have, it's not whether you have a number of important trade relationships with other countries, but it's what are the ideas that states find important to promote now? Is it democracy? Is it communism? Is it free trade? These are just examples of some ideas or values that states hold, and constructivists will argue that these are the things that are actually more impactful than simply knowing, say, whether a state has a nuclear weapon or not. The other excerpt or reading that you had to do from the Mingston-Snyder textbook was from the Peloponnesian War, the Melian dialogue written by Thucydides. So it's a very short piece. The excerpt is only a couple pages, and what you see here is a kind of bumper stickers excerpt from the two-page reading, and it says, the strong do what they have to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept. And this is probably one of the most famous lines from this text. So I want you to take a second and think about, of the three schools of thought that we just covered, realism, liberalism, and idealism or constructivism, which one of those does this kind of quote appear to relate to? Okay, if you guessed realism, you were right. Because the idea is here that what structures the system of relations between states, whether we're talking about Greek city-states or common nation-states as we now have understood them since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, is that the power and the military prowess of a state is what happens to dictate how it relates to other states and what it's able to accomplish in terms of its own survival and security in the international system. So this is a very bleak recognition of the importance of military power, and even more importantly, the hierarchy between countries and how important that is. So if you are a state at the bottom of the totem pole in the international system, you're going to have to do pretty much whatever the more powerful states want you to do. So what do you think that suggests? Well, you want to be a state that is more powerful because that means you get to dictate the terms of international relations. So this is the question I just asked about realism, or rather that Thucydides was talking about realism, and you can see how that works here with respect to this one brief quote. Again, you've got a hierarchy, and the way that you can survive in the international system is by exerting your military power. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples and think about how they relate to the theories or schools of thought discussed earlier. So early in 2016, 10 U.S. Navy men were captured off of Farsi Island by the Iranian military. And this created a crisis, a very brief but important crisis in international relations. So you have one state, right, Iran, and you have representatives of another state. In this case, you have members of the Navy from the United States. And there's this issue in which it's unclear what these individuals are doing so close to Iran's territory. In fact, they were in territorial waters right outside of Iran. And so if you're thinking about this from the perspective of the Iranian military, you have a foreign military vessel that has encroached upon your territorial waters. So what is it that you think is appropriate to do in this case? Well, think about, if we're looking at the different schools of thought, the actors that are involved. Again, we've got basically two states, and we've got an issue where the difference in military power might be important. So what kind of theory is this? Does this relate more to liberalism, constructivism, or realism? Well, remember, if we go back to the actors that are involved, if states are the only important actors, then this seems to be more relevant to realism. Let's look at one other example. Again, earlier in 2016, ISIS began, which is the international terrorist group that has occupied parts of Iraq and Syria. They began to spread their influence out to parts of Asia. And in particular, they engaged in a terrorist attack on Indonesia, which is the largest Islamic country in the world with over 200 million Muslim people. So here you have a transnational group that attacks a state for reasons related to politics or religious fundamentalism. So if we think again back to the different schools of thought, realism, liberalism, constructivism, which one of those theories might have something to say about an international terrorist group and what it does to affect a given state? Well, it's probably not liberalism, but more likely that it's idealism/constructivism, because you have a transnational group that directly attacks a state. One of the things that's really difficult about addressing the problem of terrorism is that you're, in many cases, not dealing with another country. You're dealing with a confederation or a loose organization, maybe not even one that's well organized. So you can't declare war in the legal sense on that organization because they're not represented formally by a head of state that's recognized by other countries, say in a forum like the United Nations. So this is all a way of saying that the attack that was lodged by ISIS in Indonesia probably relates more, at least on its face, to an idealist or constructivist standpoint.